Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ian Corbin. I'm a senior fellow at Capita, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Matt Feeney, who's going to talk with us about his new book, which is called Little Platoons, A Defensive Family in a Competitive Age. All right, there you are, Matt. Okay, so Matt Feeney holds a PhD in political philosophy from Duke University. He's written for The New Yorker, Slate, Pacific Standard, National Review, and The Weekly Standard. He lives with his wife and 3 children in Oakland, California. And Matt, if you could just tell us a little bit up front about the book, what motivated you to write it, and what the main argument is.
Okay. The book grew out of an article that I wrote for the New Yorker Online about the kind of prompting event was some reforms that a high school principal in suburban Philadelphia was trying to institute in his school, and and these were kind of anti-competitive reforms. I can't remember the actual details of it, but he was trying to ratchet down the kind of atmosphere of competition within this suburban high school. If you imagine this was, as a suburban upper middle class high school, the level of academic competition, the feeling of competitiveness in the school he thought was overwhelming. And he wanted to introduce some reforms, some kind of like initiatives that just kind of emphasized other things besides competition. And I came across this event on Twitter, and people were making fun of this guy. And people I generally often agreed with were making fun of this guy. And my reflex at first was to also make fun of the guy because, I'm a kind of critic of public education, or I kind of thought of myself as one of those. But then my kind of reflex as a parent kind of kicked in, and I thought, well, wait a minute, I don't like this competitive stuff either. And it just seems, and so that kind of like sent me down this kind of path investigation and reflection on this whole phenomenon. So I was just forced to ask myself what it was about the competitive system that I didn't like, because I'm in favor of competition. I'm in favor of academic rigor and all of these things. And so what was it that I didn't like? And I came, these intuitions kind of built slowly, but it was a couple of things. One, at first I thought, well, I have this background as a Kantian political theorist, and so I had this idea that, well, where do we locate these, these kind of pure ideals? Where do we locate this kind of the ideal content in our life? And I thought, well, of course, one of the places where we do that is family life. That family is one of these kind of categorical, non-negotiable values that we hold to, and we try not to dissolve across the field of contingent values. And but then, and I thought there's a certain kind of preciosity about that argument, right? That of course you got to, you have to like yield your family to a certain extent to practical concerns, to contingent concerns. You got to prepare your kids for the future and that kind of thing. And so, that was not really kind of like entirely a very satisfying account of what my, even though it was a very familiar kind of like course for me to take intellectually, it was not a very satisfying account of my problems with it. And then I kind of realized that it was more like my main problem was that the competition that we were talking about is kind of about itself. It's a kind of self-fueling process. And so it seems to me there's a kind of, a kind of governing irrationality about it, kind of Hobbesian irrationality about it. And so I kind of, as a father, I just kind of resent being kind of kind of like drawn up into a system of a kind of self-fueling system that kind of tells me what to do. It'd be one thing if I had confidence that the things that I was, kind of like being required to do to kind of keep my head above water in this competition were being done for the sake of my kids rather than for the sake of mere kind of like competitive survival or competitive conquest or whatever. And so, ultimately, I think that deep down, my kind of the fuel for my argument, the personal fuel for my argument was that I I resented being, I resented being kind of like having to kind of subject my family to this kind of feedback loop of Hobbesian competition, where it wasn't to kind of like conquer some kind of specific goal out there for the sake of my family. It was simply to kind of best other families who were doing the same. And so that was the kind of that's the kind of the same motivational basis for the both behind both the original article and the book itself.
Great. And why little platoons?
Well, it's funny because I just saw an article recently that said enough with the little platoons already, because it's it's a kind of favored conservative slogan taken from Edmund Burke. From Reflections on the Revolution in France. It's beautiful. I love the phrase, and I love the writing that it's embedded in. But as I write my, the title, I wasn't originally going to call it Little Platoons. My agent actually suggested calling it that. And as I got going on the book, I realized that there was a kind of irony in the title, in that there's a suggestion of fighting, which in a way is kind of a theme of the book. There's kind of fighting back against the system, but it's also ironic in that the system itself is a product of our kind of like a desire to fight for our kids and to fight for kind of like opportunity. And so the argument in the book ultimately becomes a kind of commentary on the hijacking of this healthy and utterly primal and central impulse that we have as parents to want to do well for our children, and the hijacking of this impulse, the way in which this impulse gets turned into fuel for this competition and fuel for the institutions that kind of operate along the kind of lifeline of this competition, and subject families to their kind of disciplinary requirements for participation.
Yeah. So what's the healthy version that Burke is referring to of having a family as a platoon?
That's a good question. I mean, the healthy version is, it's a kind of presumptuous for me to say what it was. My sense was that it would be, families kind of abiding in private space, kind of having their own little folkways, being able to, kind of like generate little family cultures that are their own. I have kind of long digression in my chapter on competitive sports on Johann Huizinga's book, Homo Ludens, which talks about play.
Right. And
I find a lot of resonance in Homo Ludens, the way he talks about play as a private space, that play originates a private space, just a kind of social space among participants. And I find a lot of kind of interesting and kind of evocative parallels between that construction of play and of family life as a kind of private space that is it's kind of our own space. And within that space, we create our own meanings, we create our own languages, we create our own jokes. And so kind of I suppose a modern or postmodern way of celebrating the family as a little platoon is in this kind of idea of kind of carving it off from the kind of meaning imperatives of public life, and where there's not just public life, but the market and the kind of values that govern the outside world, the shallow kind of fungibilities that govern the outside world, versus the little bits of understanding amid family members that are understandable only to family members, that have a kind of private significance. And so when I think of the value of little platoons, I kind of think of kind of like a positive resonance from that phrase. I think of it in those terms of kind of hermeneutic terms of private versus public meaning.
Yeah. So I flipped through and I looked up the passage last night where Burke uses the phrase. And one thing he's interested in there is the idea that the family is a little platoon that sort of teaches you how to love, and it becomes like the germ, he says, for wider affections. So you kind of learn how to relate to people and love people in this intimate sphere, and then that broadens out to the point where you can love your countrymen and love your fellow humans. And I thought it was really interesting because it looks in your book like this sort of hyper competitive system that we are part of has turned the platoon from being something that trains us to love everyone to something that we have to kind of mobilize to fight everyone.
Right.
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 And then, like, if Burke is right about the healthy function of little platoons, then we should expect that this change would, like, poison our public life to some degree, right? It would cause us to regard each other with suspicion instead of to learn to love.
Yeah, and I think you see that. I mean, I think that there is the idea that there is some kind of ladder of affections that connects, family to nation or whatever. It's a pretty hard observation to sustain these days. And so, yeah, so I think that is that's true. And so, and I think it also kind of, you might say, it also kind of explains my more kind of recessive understanding of kind of, I present you with my own kind of like valorization of the idea of little platoons as not as looking upward into this kind of outer world, but kind of like essentially taking for granted that the outer world is not a particularly hospitable place, and seeking to kind of turn, a kind of it's a kind of, almost a kind of radicalization of this kind of Victorian idea of the family as a private space, and it's a lamentable kind of move to have to make, I think. But at the same time, I feel like there's a kind of a need to preserve that kind of unassimilability of the kind of the private experience, because it's so much of the kind of experience beyond that sphere becomes kind of inhospitable or incomprehensible.
Right. So I have a lot of questions along this line, but maybe we should get a little bit concrete for people who haven't read the book yet. So if you could walk us through in a few minutes kind of the main argument, how you think these little platoons have been changed in this way, and kind of what are the strongest forces that are impinging upon the family and kind of pushing it in this direction.
So, well, one of the interesting things that the book itself kind of like contains analyses of a handful of different kind of institutional actors that we kind of interact with as parents and families, and it kind of makes I think it makes a kind of novel argument in that it's not just that, the way you put it is that these things kind of impinge upon us, and that's, to a certain extent, that's true. But I also want to draw out the fact that that their effect on us is kind of to take our kind of latent willingness to act, our latent willingness to do things for our kids, and incites, kind of like inflames that tendency, and seeks to bring it out of us even more. And so so, for example, I'll start kind of at the end, just to give an idea of the kind of the thrust of the argument. The book ends with a kind of like a more involved discussion of college admissions, in which I argue that the competition among people kind of like leaves these institutions, especially selective colleges, in this kind of gatekeeping position, where the kind of fury of our competitive adaptations and our attempts to kind of outdo each other, and our kids' attempts to outdo each other, leaves these people in this position of receiving this enormous input of human effort, that is, the effort of these kids. And these kids are, massively well qualified. They kind of, so when their applications reach these schools, they all kind of look alike. In the schools, and this gives the schools a tremendous amount of selection power. They look down upon this population of applicants, and they say, well, we can't really see it very well. We want you to do more so that we can see you. And so this is another incitement for families and for kids, then to get busy kind of like providing these bureaucracies with information. So we're kind of constantly goaded into kind of doing basically performing, helping these administrations perform their own functions by providing them data to help help our kids want to tell themselves apart from each other. And so this gives these institutions a lot of leverage to tell these kids how to be, right? So as well, at this point, well, we can't see you well enough, show us, show us how passionately committed you are by starting a nonprofit. And the kids start nonprofits, and so like these cues come down from the top, and the kids kind of, the colleges, say jump, and the kids say how high, and they're, because of this kind of like competitive mindset that everyone is in, people are willing to kind of like take these cues and run with them, go as, and respond with kind of maximum effort. And you watch the behavior of the selective colleges in this environment, and they're just drunk with the power that this gives them. And they seek to extend their power deeper and deeper into the minds and the souls of their applicants. And so this is, so here's the kind of consummation of the argument that the process, the competitive intensity that we all kind of find ourselves in sends us into this fury of activity that the institutions themselves turn to their own advantage. Now, it sounds kind of conspiratorial when I say that, there is a kind of intentional aspect of it at this highest level of college admissions. But in the other areas where I talk about it, it's more kind of incidental, and it's more a kind of organic process. Like in, for example, in sports, in competitive club sports, I talk about the way that, families kind of throw themselves into sports. Probably you go into the join a competitive sports club, and because it's the only way that your kid can play competitive sports is in this, say your competitive soccer club or whatever. And otherwise it's just kind of, that's just what sports are these days. And so once you've kind of like gotten into that, then all of a sudden you find yourself, the clubs are kind of just kind of absorb the effort that we do, and they kind of use it to kind of a kind of relationship and evolves between the clubs and the families, where the clubs do, the clubs simply expect that families are going to throw tons of money in and essentially continually make not just money, but effort, and make endless demands. Okay, we're going to go to Spain this year. We're going to go to Hawaii. We're going to go all these different places for tournaments. And they just expect that it's not entirely clear why, for competitive athletic reasons, this needs to be done. But it's just a kind of maximalist logic that takes over once the kind of institutions and the families come together within this kind of competitive framework. The families just, become willing to put out as much effort as institutions will ask. And because the families are willing to do it, the institutions constantly have an incentive to ask for more. And,
right, you can say that they're not just forming soccer players; they're expecting your family to become a soccer family.
Right.
So your finances and your schedule, like it all kind of gets shaped by the needs of the team.
Right, and the team, and this is something else that another side of the thing that I wanted to emphasize too. And this is the kind of kind of the political side of the argument is that the teams are competing with each other. So we kind of talk about the families being in competition with each other, but once, and this is an American thing, and this is I kind of point this out, that the kind of old kind of Tocquevillian sociology of civil society that, Americans, especially American conservatives, value, which, I value it too. And I've kind of always often thought of it as a very healthy and uniquely American thing. But once that system gets kind of networked into the system of competition, then then its nature changes. So that partly you see in sports, for example, the clubs kind of, the parents, of course, the families are kind of like in this competitive relationship with each other for this kind of future, the various advantages that are supposed to flow from joining competitive club sports. But the clubs are also in competition with each other. And so because they're in competition with each other, they always want to be kind of proving to families they're in competition with each other for the kind of cliency of these families, and because the families can always change to another club, and so it's a deeply unstable, it's a deeply unstable competitive system where everyone can always kind of jump to a different a different club, and so. And so the clubs then are kind of always have this incentive to say, well, we're doing more for your kid, right? So we're going to more intense tournaments. We're doing more kind of things that are going to help your kid get a college scholarship, which is the kind of endpoint of all this stuff. Yeah. And so because the clubs are kind of also kind of involved in and networked into this kind of large scale competitive enterprise of especially kind of access to good colleges and the like, they also their contribution to the process is also kind of like driven by a kind of competitive anxiety, a worry about being left behind. And so
yeah. So one thing that was really interesting that you didn't sort of make it explicit at the end, as I wondered if you might, but as you're talking through a lot of these different kind of public structures that end up shaping the private family, you're often talking about the future, right? And so like soccer clubs it's not like for now that you're doing this. It's not for the experience now of the game, of the whatever. It's always development, right? It's always sort of pointing down the road. And you almost have the sense that like, it's just a series of deferrals, right? Like on every point and every way that these structures are kind of shaping the family, it's for something else that's somewhere else all the time. That's right?
Yeah. So that's it. Yeah. So I do kind of like, that there is the future is a big problem, right? And we have to solve this problem. And so one of the, I appreciate, it seems that you're gesturing at this idea that our orientation toward the future kind of like is constantly kind of throwing us out of a kind of mindfulness about the present and appreciation of the present. The facticity of the present versus this kind of idea that we have to always chase. And so that's one kind of like unfortunate aspect of this. And another one that I kind of oftentimes, and also, I mean, simply dwelling in the future is a way of dwelling in, it's an encouragement to just dwell in fear, right? I mean, I'm an anxious person. You can probably pick that up from my presentation here, but and so like I feel like I'm the kind of ideal subject to kind of understand what happens when we kind of like are encouraged to occupy the future. And one of the things I think this is in I talk about this in the sports chapter, but that but our orientation toward the future also kind of like tends to leave us with a sort of technological understanding of our circumstances, that things we look at our situation, well, how can we improve? By what methods can we improve this? How can I optimize my kids? How can I, what improvements can I affect upon my children? And it's a kind of degraded way to go about family life, I think.
But it's also fascinating because you're kind of in the system that you're describing. You kind of have this burden to always be preparing for the future, but you're freed from the burden of having to decide what the future should be, because it's sort of like the admissions department at Harvard, like that's the telos, that's the terminus. I mean, am I reading you right? That like, as parents, we're like, like it's not up to me. Like I was told to shape my son in this way for the natural end, which is getting into Harvard. And so like for me, things kind of run on the rails, and I'm just always trying to push him towards where I know he belongs.
Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So are you saying that like we don't really kind of like, well, so yeah. So there's a way in which then because of this, the idea of like getting in Harvard becomes almost this kind of quantitative kind of thing. I describe it at one point as that we're trying to fill our kids with like at the maximum amount of accepted to Harvard, this quantity called accepted to Harvard that we can get, and like depending on how much of that we succeed in filling them with, they might get accepted to somewhere, and it will determine where they get accepted to. And so yeah, so it kind of like it displaces from our kind of understanding of child rearing other kind of non-quantifiable, non-accepted to Harvard values.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so I have a 13-year-old, and I'm starting to think with him. He's very bright. I'm starting to think with him about what he should do for high school. And my natural inclination is like, let's do something elite, set him up for the next step, which is we'll be applying to college. He's a bright kid. It'll be good for him to be around other bright kids. But I realized, and actually reading your book was helpful in this way, that I haven't kind of sat down and thought really hard about this actual person, this small person, and like what does seem to conduce to his flourishing, right? Like what kind of social environment, what kind of academic environment really would just make him come alive as a person. And that's hard work. That's careful work, right? To look at closely at a child. And I almost feel like it's a relief in some occasions to like not have to do it. I was really struck by, so about a little over 10 years ago, I was working as an SAT tutor in Fairfield County in Connecticut, which is like hyper competitive, very wealthy place. And at that time, the rage was to be well-rounded. So students were just, usually the moms didn't work and the students were just shuttled. Like, every afternoon they had like appointment, because they had to be like running various clubs and like going to Honduras to build homes and like, lettering in a bunch of different sports. And it was mania. Like it was horrifying. And then they also all had therapists too, because this was driving them nuts. So like all the kids had to be taken to their various therapists. And that's a pretty direct demand of elite colleges at the time. But you said something in the book which makes me think that maybe that's changed, and that actually a new directive has come down since I got out of the business, that instead of wanting well-rounded kids, now the word is that they should be well lopsided. Does that?
Right. No, the first time I came across that word in a book that was published actually, much earlier, and I was kind of surprised at how early it was. It was like in the 2007, maybe. I can't remember the name of the book. But it definitely now you see this kind of poo-pooing of the idea of well-roundedness for the sake of this other value, which is, well lopsided. But there's a whole bunch of different ways in which the kind of idea of more individualized, so it's not just about a quantity of extracurriculars that you're conquering, but that it is in fact the way I put it in the chapter is that the schools kind of encountered simultaneously an observation problem and a legitimation problem with this problem well-roundedness, because at a certain point, it got out that this was what was happening, is that it was just a grind and it was ridiculous and it was fake.
Yeah.
Am I still on? I just got some weird notification. It was fake. And so the colleges say, well, they solved the observation problem and the legitimation problem at the same time by kind of like moving their focus more toward individualized considerations, because on one hand, it just sounds better, right? It sounds, well, we really want to know the individual. And it also improves their, kind of like it gives you a sense of the kind of heightened resolution that they're now seeking. What they want a better view of their applicants. And so instead of a bunch of different things, there's a quote where I quote a admissions coach who says that instead of a bunch of, like maximizing the number of your activities, it's better to show that you're really passionate about one or two things and get yourself on a board of directors of a nonprofit, and these start, you can. So one of the things that you see now is that kids are starting nonprofits.
Yeah.
Ambitious high schoolers are now like, this is the thing, is to kind of distinguish yourself by starting your own nonprofit. I don't know if you saw this on Twitter, but there was a kid from Fremont, California, posted his notifications page from Facebook, where he had like 2 columns of his classmates all asking them to like the nonprofits that they founded. And it's, this is, so this is the new thing. So it sounds better, but in fact, it doesn't really make things any less intense. What it does though, is it gives, there's a kind of therapeutic impulse in these kind of college administrations. They kind of like want to kind of like reinterpret their functions in therapeutic terms, And so it gives them the kind of leverage to say, well, what's inside you? Tell us what's inside you. And in doing that, it also gives them the leverage to tell these kids what should be inside them, to prescribe a kind of model of person. And that's what so this series, and this is especially true in the admission side of this argument. There's a lot more kind of aspects of my argument, but especially true in the admission side of my argument, where the evolving selection methods of these colleges are become, kind of like incidentally and then intentionally propagate kind of models of person that these kids should try to become. And so that's one of the things that I kind of really liked. Then I kind of like seemed to, both from when I first wrote the article to when I wrote this book, and I really wanted to kind of emphasize not just the reality of, but to me the moral outrage of. Is the kind of degree of moral leverage that these colleges have attained over the kind of inner lives of these kids, and the kind of shamelessness with which they use it.
Okay. Yeah. So, right. So we've used the phrase a couple of times, I think you refer to it, and I actually have a review of the book coming out soon where I talk about the haven in a heartless world. And that's right, you talked about it as being a Victorian ideal of family, right? The sort of closeted, protected, private sphere. But so that arises in response to the Industrial Revolution, where like families aren't embedded anymore in, little ancestral villages. They kind of move to the big cities, these big anonymous cities, to work in the factories. And it's like, well, oh no, like this is, terribly alienating and scary. So you're going to seal off the family. You're like, okay, but here you'll be safe, right? Here, this will be your little domain where you're the boss and, you run your life. And what I wondered reading your book was whether that kind of modern settlement is unstable, right? And whether that plan to have like a massively dynamic, creative destruction heavy economy with little islands of protective family, like, does that not work, right? Does all that is solid melt into thin air?
Yeah, I mean, what's funny is that capitalism, it turns out that capitalism is only one of the kind of like solvents in this, but I mean, I think that it is unstable. And this is one of the things, this is one of the political educations that has, that I've kind of undergone while both just being a parent and also working on this book. The kind of political complacency that is implicit in this idea of the family, right? So while we can't really we can't impose any kind of positive, ideal, utopian content on the outside world, that's simply going, capitalism is simply going to have its way. Yeah. And so we need to kind of create, this is, for me, this is a kind of, working out of these two sides of positive, negative freedom, or whatever you want to call it. That I get from working in Kantian political theory. Like, so that, the family then becomes the kind of locus of, and maybe the last, maybe aesthetic culture becomes another one of these zones of, to use a Frankfurt School term, is kind of a zone of non-identity, a place where like non-capitalism abides, where like where inherent values abide. But it seems as if, the kind of the collapsing of politics kind of into this, or the ideal content of politics into these like little private zones, is really, like you say, it's unstable. It seems like there's, it needs more protection than that ultimately the little platoon is going to be kind of like overrun by the forces of competition. And that perhaps, I kind of conclude on this note that like, that a better way to, perhaps a better way to protect the autonomy of family life is to kind of create is a kind of politics that seeks to control the kind of governing force of these of capitalism, for lack of of a less economical term, control the governing force of these outside forces. And so, in other words, there's a kind of apolitics of the kind of haven and heartless world model. And I think that, an apolitical approach at this point seems to be inadequate, and that, so yes.
Well, I mean, it's so interesting because, it's supposed to be this totally autonomous sphere, right? Like that's the promise. They're like, yeah, like public life's going to be nuts, but like you'll have your little haven. And what I see through a lot of the book is that our havens are less free than that, right? They're sort of less autonomous than theoretically they're supposed to be. But by the same token, I think some stuff that you kind of point out towards the end of the book, like we're right. So
that last bit,
there's this assumption. Sorry. So that actually, if you look closer, we're much freer than we realize, right? So like you talk about some strategies you've had of like holding this stuff at bay, as simple as just not buying an iPhone for your daughter, which is like,
that takes effort.
Yeah, no, I know, but it's a thing that a person can put their foot down about, right? Like, there's no one bashing on your door, like forcing you to buy iPhones. And you also point out that there's just something of a mythology around the impact that a selective college will have, right? Where we assume that like, if I can get my kid into Bowdoin, right, like he's going to make X amount of money. If I can only get him into UMass, he's going to make half that or something. And what you point out is that there's actually, it's probably much more of a selection process than a sort of creation process. That if he's a bright kid, he was going to be, and with a good work ethic, he was going to do well, right? And it doesn't matter that much where he goes to college. So that we can just stop, right? Like, a strong set of parents can just decide we're not playing that game and we don't believe it. You don't own us in that way. But you're also, you have a PhD in Kantian political philosophy. You're probably some of these forces than the average parent would be, right? Like you're probably a little more willing to comb through the social scientific literature and be like, all right, this is nonsense, right? So,
the Alan Kruger studies about the returns to college that say, it's more selection than treatment effect, but yeah, most people haven't done that, and it's it's very hard. It's very easy to absorb these. It's very easy to absorb the cues, and it's very hard to resist them. And even I mean, with all the kind of philosophical reason, kind of buttressing my efforts.
Yeah.
And a wife who is very much a kind of co-conspirator of mine in this stuff, and by disposition is much kind of better at kind of like doing it than I am. I still, kind of struggle, and it's still a hard thing. You kind of think about your kid and you think about these things, gosh, what are they missing out on? What am I not giving them? And so, yeah, it's really, it's hard. I mean, so yes, you can do it yourself, but I also say that you can't, it's hard to do it yourself because you have to choose to do it yourself, but the kind of structure of incentives for which choices you make are themselves so kind of overloaded with these incentives to kind of compete.
Yeah,
it's not the individual choice is not the individual level response to it. There's a kind of therapeutic value in thinking that you have this power, but systemically speaking, you don't really, that power's not that great.
Well, you have some interesting reflections on the sort of psychology of using technology, where like all kids want a smartphone now, and they all argue that every one of their classmates in the whole world has one. But you also point out that there's another bit of this kind of preparation for the future aspect to technology. Like I want my kids to be hooked in. I want them to be ready. I want them to be sort of accessing the world in this kind of smooth, amazing, technologically streamlined way. So that even that there's a sort of aspect of competition too, right? It's not just like their sort of feckless desire to play Candy Crush or whatever kids are doing now, but it's also built into that same system of like you wanting them to excel according to the kind of the dictates of the game. I ask you, how many smartphones are in as of the writing of the book, you had resisted your daughter's
All right, so I
request
think
for a
my
smartphone.
sixth grade when I wrote that chapter. She spent
Yeah.
all of middle school as pretty much the only kid without a smartphone.
Yeah.
But at the end of, and she came with a companion, this was also at the time of COVID coming on. She was at the end of her 8th grade year when COVID hit. And so she had the kind of compelling argument that she was not going to be able to stay connected to her friends unless she got a phone before middle school ended and she could collect everybody's whatever, at a certain point,
wins.
yeah. But the thing is, it's because at a certain point, your fanaticism, I feel like I'm kind of proud of my fanaticism. My wife and I are both kind of like proud of our the kind of like fanatical kind of team that we kind of make. And but at the same time, it starts to feel like fanaticism. It starts to feel like you're being a bit dogmatic and a bit kind of a bit harsh, and so you give in. But even giving in, I gave in because it seemed, not giving in at that point seemed kind of almost cruel. But at the same time, I hate it. I don't like I don't like that. Because I don't like it myself. I have like this grab my iPhone reflex, and I hate to see it in my kids because it's simply. It is, it's a kind of outside, it's an alien power, to use the kind of Marx term, kind of like visiting us and kind of like dictating to us how we should be. And I just kind of resent it. I feel like I should have more control over my family life than that. And not only because it's alien, but it's unhealthy. It's weird how like we've all just kind of like yielded to the sovereignty of this manifestly unhealthy thing. And
yeah, it's so interesting. So in Haven in a Heartless World, Lash talks about the kind of a problem that occurs in child development when we move from sort of family farms and cottage industry to kind of factory work, which is that like authority kind of gets pulled out of the home and placed elsewhere. So kids are now aware that like their dad is and their mom are deeply beholden to someone else who's the real boss, right? Who pulls the real strings. And as I was reading your book, I was thinking like that dynamic is so much thicker now, right? And you say at one point that your daughter seemed to admire you for resisting, for like being the only one who wouldn't let her have an iPhone. So, I think there might even be some sort of ambivalences in that way that like, there might be something almost sad for the kids about like realizing that like, look, dad's got to do what the system demands, right? And if this is what Harvard wants from us, like dad and mom are gonna give it to them.
Yeah, it's one of the this goes to Lash too, but I had this. I remember having this kind of like epiphany about the labor movement and how it must have been for men in the early time of the formation of labor unions with real power, what it must have meant for them domestically, right? That like this idea that dad, the difference between a dad who's kind of coming home from his work in the factory when it's clear that like he completely has no control over the conditions of his work, and it shows on his face and in his body when he comes home from work, versus a dad who comes home talking about his union meeting and who's kind of like, who seems to have some control over his outside world. It would seem to have a kind of he's proud of his not just his job, but his standing, vis-a-vis the organization that he's kind of part of. Yeah. And so this is, so the flip side of the I think the Lash thing especially is this pathos of a kind of larger, more robust Republican autonomy that comes from involvement in something like labor union. So like, how do we kind of recapitulate that? How do we recreate that in our current setting? It's a hard thing to come up with, but the alternative is like you say that our kid, whatever, to kind of like exhibit in our own homes is really to kind of reinstantiate this problem of isolation, to like say, well, I'm the boss in this little home. That doesn't really get you very far.
Yeah. So something that we've been talking about at Capita and that we hope to do some research into is the question of how worker ownership of a company might impact family formation.
Interesting.
And something that was suggested to us actually by the head of a conservative think tank was that it may be that, our hypothesis is that if you know that you own what you're doing and you're not just like a hireling, you're not just working for the boss, that you might be likely to get married younger, like have more children, like stay married longer, something like that. So we're looking into that. I think it's a super interesting question and plausible, but also the fact that this was suggested to us by a political conservative, it reminds me of some of the you mentioned a couple of times in the book that you are yourself a political conservative of some type.
I have been. I haven't voted for a Republican president, I think, since 2000. But
Okay.
but like my reflexes remain kind of like formed by a long kind of involvement with that set of ideas.
Okay. Well, so what I want to ask is, there was a piece in the New York Times yesterday about what the author calls a generational shift among Republicans. Basically, that younger Republicans are much more open to things like Romney's, recent proposal about I don't know what he calls it, child, not tax credits, but get a child allowance.
Child allowance, right?
Right. And so this had been, from kind of mid-century America up till now, right around now, the kind of governing assumption on the right was very much this Victorian model that like we can have a chaotic public square, a sort of dynamic, factory shutting down and opening, and we just protect the family, protect the nuclear family. And I wonder if you see any sort of like sea change happening, because I kind of suspect I do, where people on the right are like, ooh, you know what, actually those barriers we thought we could hold up, like not holding up as well as they used to. So, I mean, what are your thoughts about like where the direction the kind of national conversation is going about this stuff and how you position yourself within that?
I think it's fantastic. Samuel Hammond at Niskanen, his stuff on, it's just fantastic stuff. And I'm really, and I'm actually really heartened by, the child allowance stuff. And I feel like it's amazing what a perverse position the kind of congressional Republican have put themselves in this when,
Marco
and it's, for people who've kind of watched, like with horror or optimism, the kind of Trump phenomenon, there's this whole kind of like thing, of course, it's not exactly in the background, but certainly as people kind of tease it up as a reason for hope, is this kind of recasting of the idea of the relationship between public policy and the family. And it seems to me that it's like this stuff is really, I find it really hopeful, and it's really necessary. And and it's like I can't even get. It's just so hard to get your head around the set of incentives that I suppose they're manifest. They're clear enough, why it is that a Republican Congress, Republican congressmen do not go along with it. But it's sad, because I feel like I think that I'm not a political scientist. I can't really say what the political effects of it are going to be or what its political meaning is. But as a policy development and to the extent that it really is kind of like moving into the hearts of conservative intellectuals is I think it's a great development.
Yeah, something that I'm kind of trying more and more to keep in mind is the degree to which the generation that's in charge right now sort of has its imagination formed by the post-war boom, right? And that period of tremendous growth, like where labor unions, the family wage was a thing that you could have, and sort of assuming that we should shape our politics and our common life around that kind of assumption that we're going to see that kind of growth, that kind of mobility. And it may just be that was a flash in the pan, and we shouldn't expect it, and we have to plan for other contingencies. Okay, so we have a couple of questions in from the audience, and I'll read one to you. This is from my old friend Agnes Howard. So what she asks is it really competition that nudges us to behave this way? So smartphones, soccer clubs, all that. Might blame also be placed on child-rearing fashions to prioritize the individual child and child's choices, what Agnes Callard calls acceptance parenting. such that there's hardly a little platoon or sense of common weal, even within the family itself?
You know, I'm open to the idea that there are other things that feed into this. But it's hard for me to, I mean, like, to the extent that, like, it's hard for me not to kind of like ascribe competitive behavior to competitive motives, you know, and so, you know, and also I think that entangling, you know, kind of like the a cause and effect here is probably, or disentangling cause and effect is a kind of a hard thing. But I mean, I read Agnes Collard's article on acceptance parenting. I cannot at this point kind of like recall its substance, but I remember finding it really interesting. You know, she's a really interesting thinker, and so I don't want to. I will just beg off on kind of like giving a definitive answer to the question, just because I can't remember the details of her argument, except that I like it. There's probably not really that much of a disagreement. It would just be some effort to stitch together what the areas of agreement are.
Yeah, great. So, I mean, we've talked a bit about the, you know, however these forces, whatever the forces are that are binding us into this situation that seems to be kind of colonizing the family on behalf of some foreign force or another. You know, we're talking to a political philosopher who has, you know, relatively robust understanding of these things, relatively robust ability to resist. Kind of like we see, you know, you hear these stories of tech CEOs who have totally tech-free homes.
Right.
And their kids can only play with wood toys because they know what they're feeding us. So, you know, apart from, you know, given that even exceptionally well-equipped people have a really hard time struggling with these forces, this is not a nice question to ask you, but like, what can we do? Like, what can we do for like us generally, right? Like me and you, maybe we can really kind of put our heads together and write some articles and like put our foot down at our homes. But like, if we try to think about our collective life, like what kind of stuff even comes to mind as a way to make the situation better?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a tolerant, people might be kind of like forgiven for viewing my kind of like discussion of this and my conclusion as somewhat thin and if not cowardly, but you know, like I would hope to see, I mean, well, think of it this way, not every country is like this, right? So not every country has the same culture. And so what is it that, you know, distinguishes, you know, different, the countries that don't have this culture from the ones that do? And there's a lot of things. And I think that, you know, part of it, you know, we find ourselves in this situation, you know, by certain institutional accidents. I describe it, you know, I think I use the term at least one time in the book, maybe more than once, the accidents of institutional design, that the distributed nature of American civil society, which used to be one of a kind of I think really a kind of valuable thing in our country, has kind of turned into something else. And so that's a kind of hard thing to overcome because it's so deeply embedded in the makeup of the institutional makeup of the country. But, you know, just like public policies that kind of give us this, you know, like a safety net kind of that actually functions psychologically as a safety net, where when you kind of look at your kid and you think, well, what his options are either success on the pyramid, right? You know, getting as high up on the pyramid of success as possible, or utter failure. Right. And if somehow or another, if the policy environment in which family takes place is such that we don't go so readily to that second option, that we can imagine that like there's more than one kind of, so I mean, so I guess what I'm saying is that there's a kind of public, you know, a public policy environment in which, you know, and I think, like we just said, I think that we're kind of, I hope that we're moving in that direction where the feeling of you know, the nearness of utter failure is not so present.
Great, yeah, absolutely. And I find that like my students at elite colleges in Boston are often like fired not by like any great ambition, but by the sense that like this could all collapse, like right. And they actually they tend to put it like, you know, I'm studying business, I'm going to work in a consulting firm because I don't want to be homeless.
Right. And, you know, I'm not really sure. I'm not sure, you know, how accurate that is. And this kind of goes back to we were talking about your son and like what to do your son.
Right.
And one of the unfortunate things, one of the really unfortunate things about I don't, do we cut off immediately at 10 o'clock? Is that like a guillotine falling?
No, I think it's not, but yeah, we'll wrap up in 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay. But just the idea that the nature of the kind of like the idea that this competition is a single thing, right? It's a single hierarchy, a single pyramid of college opportunity and job opportunity, and the idea that which used to be a kind of assumption behind American civil society, is that you could take these different channels, right? So that you didn't have to like work for McKinsey or work somewhere on the hierarchy to McKinsey in order to like have a viable life. That you could go to, you go to a regional college, which your neighbors knew about, but maybe people in distant states didn't know about, and this college would give you a good education. And the idea that somehow or another, this kind of broken up nature, this broken up kind of landscape where things would, things have their own regional character and kids have their own kind of interests and natures that you can cultivate separately, that all of this has to be dissolved into a single hierarchy. That is the kind of thing that I think it's unfortunate that we've lost. We feel like we can only indulge at a cost.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I mean, with so many questions that I, the hard questions I try to think about America, I find myself, the only recourse I have is to stop thinking about America. And to start thinking about like more local levels, and like the fact that life actually takes place for me in Cambridge, Massachusetts, for you in Oakland, California. And just the fact that I can see everything now,
right,
doesn't mean that my life takes place on the global stage, right? Like, so.
Yeah.
All right, well, this is great, Matt. For everyone watching, this will be posted on YouTube, so if you liked the conversation, feel free to share it with others. And Matt, good luck with the rest of the book rollout, and thank you so much.
All right, thanks a lot, Ian.
All right, bye.